Barbados, 1816. Night descends over the endless sugar fields, sweet in name, but bitter in truth. Among the whispering canes stands a woman, her voice trembling yet unyielding. They've signed our freedom, they just hid the papers. Her name was Nanny Grigg, a literate house servant who turned faith into fire. Before dawn, her words would ignite the island and the empire itself. In the early years of the 19th century, Barbados was known as the jewel of the British Empire. On maps, it glimmered like a tropical Eden: green hills, calm seas, endless rows of sugarcane swaying in the wind. But step closer, and the air thickened with the smell of sweat, blood, and burning molasses. Behind the grandeur of the white plantation houses stood the true machinery of the island's wealth. Over 80,000 African men and women, forced to work 16 hours a day beneath a sun that felt more like punishment than warmth. The fields were not just fields, they were open-air prisons. Overseers rode on horseback with whips coiled at their sides, their shouts slicing through the humid air. The clang of the mill, the groan of the rollers crushing cane stalks, and the distant cries of the exhausted created the island's terrible rhythm, a symphony of suffering. At night, when the furnaces glowed red and the stars dimmed under clouds of smoke, some would hum old African songs to remember who they were. Others stayed silent, fearing that even dreams could betray them. Among them was Nanny Grigg, a woman unlike most others on the island. She had once worked in the big house, cleaning fine furniture, serving tea, and learning the language of those who owned her. Somehow, she had learned to read, perhaps from a sympathetic servant, perhaps by pure will. In the still hours of the night, she read fragments of the Bible and pamphlets left behind by English visitors. She discovered words like justice, liberty, deliverance, and once she understood their meaning, she could never unlearn them. When she returned to the fields, her eyes no longer looked down. She watched, listened, and waited. She began to notice how fear worked, how it kept people quiet, how it chained the soul more than iron ever could, and she began to speak in ways that slipped under the overseer's ears. Her message was simple, but explosive. The Queen has freed us. They just hid the papers. No one knew if it was true, but in a place built entirely on hopelessness, even a whisper of freedom was enough to make hearts beat differently. By the time the sun rose over the cane fields again, the paradise of Barbados had begun to tremble not from the lash, but from belief. What separated Nanny Grigg from the others was not strength, but knowledge, the rarest form of power among the enslaved. Her literacy was a weapon disguised as grace. To read was to see beyond the plantation walls, to understand that somewhere across the ocean, men in fine suits were arguing about morality while she and her people were dying for sugar. She read the Bible to others by candlelight, her voice low but steady. The passages about Moses freeing his people, about God hearing the cry of the oppressed, they became more than scripture. They became prophecy, and Nanny, though small and soft-spoken, began to sound like someone chosen for a mission. The more she read, the clearer the contradiction became. England, the land of kings, parliaments, and churches, was debating the end of slavery. Yet here, in its most loyal colony, human beings were beaten for looking too long at the horizon. The hypocrisy burned in her chest like fever. At first, she shared her thoughts only with a few trusted friends, women who worked the kitchens, men who hauled cane. But the idea traveled faster than rumor. It reached the barracks and the boiling houses, the corners of the island where even the overseer's reach was thin. Freedom already signed, they said, hidden by the masters. It was not a political statement. It was faith reshaped into rebellion. One night, a storm rolled over the island. Rain hammered the roofs of the slave quarters. Thunder growled like the anger of heaven. In that storm, Nanny's resolve hardened. She whispered to a young man beside her, a quiet, broad-shouldered field hand named Busa. "If they keep it from us," she said, "then we take it ourselves." Busa nodded slowly. The rain drowned their words, but not their meaning. That night, lightning split the sky over the cane fields, illuminating faces wet with rain and resolve. The fire that would consume Barbados did not begin with torches or swords. It began with a woman who could read and dared to believe that God himself was waiting for her people to rise. The sugarcane swayed under the storm like a congregation in prayer, and somewhere, deep inside the dark, a rebellion began to breathe. Hope spreads in silence, It doesn't roar like thunder, it seeps through cracks, carried in whispers. In the slave quarters of Barbados, that whisper was Nanny Grigg's voice. Her words traveled through the humid night like wind weaving through sugarcane. Freedom is already ours. No one dared to question her. For years they had prayed for deliverance, but their prayers had grown brittle. Now, someone among them claimed the miracle had already come stolen, hidden away by deceitful hands. It was a story both unbelievable and irresistible. In the dim huts of the plantations, men and women leaned close, passing her words like smuggled treasure. The Queen signed it, some said. The masters burned the papers, said others. Truth didn't matter anymore. The story gave them something real. Permission to hope. Across the parish of Street Phillip, where sugar fields rolled toward the sea, the idea reached a man named Busa. He was older than most, quiet, broad-shouldered, with eyes that carried both patience and fury. Born in Africa, enslaved since youth, he understood strategy, the discipline of timing. For years, he had waited, pretending submission, while gathering strength in silence. When he met Nanny, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of purpose. He listened as she repeated her claim that freedom had already been granted, but instead of correcting her, he smiled faintly. He knew her words were not literal. They were revolutionary. If they've hidden it, he said, we'll make them show it. Together, they began to sow the seed deeper. Church meetings turned into secret councils. Bible readings became war rooms. Each verse about deliverance was read like a command. Women carried messages in baskets of laundry. Men passed them under the guise of trading tools. By March 1816, the fields of Barbados were alive with tension. The overseers sensed it but couldn't locate its source. It was like the air before lightning, thick, heavy, waiting. And at the center of it stood Nanny Grigg, small in stature, but with a presence that filled every silence. She had become something no empire could chain, a voice that belonged to everyone. April 14th, 1816, the night of Easter Sunday. For most of the island, it was a time of hymns and candlelight. For the people of the plantations, it was the night chosen to burn the lie to the ground. Busa gathered his men near Bailey's plantation, their faces dimly lit by lanterns hidden under sacks. They carried machetes, sticks, and torches, poor weapons against empire, but symbols of defiance nonetheless. The plan was simple: strike after nightfall, burn the cane fields, and free the imprisoned. Nanny Grigg was there. She did not carry a weapon. Her presence alone was enough. She stood among them, her hair tied back, her face streaked with soot and faith. Around her the air was electric. Some knelt to pray, others sharpened their blades. The scent of sugar mixed with smoke. When the first flame took, it was small, a trembling tongue of light licking the edge of the cane. Then another, and another. Soon the fields glowed red, as if the island itself had opened its eyes. From the hills, the fire could be seen for miles. It raced through the rows of cane like a living creature, devouring everything it touched. The sky turned the color of blood. Bells rang in the distance, not for worship, but for alarm. Cries of "Freedom for Barbados" echoed through the night. Chains were shattered, gates were torn down. For the first time in memory, the masters fled, and the enslaved stood upright in the flames that once consumed them. Nanny's silhouette glowed against the inferno, calm, unafraid. She raised her arms, not in triumph, but in faith. "God," she whispered, "you said let my people go." In that moment, under the burning sky, Barbados was free not by decree, but by belief. The rebellion would not last, but that night, for a few hours, the enslaved of Barbados saw heaven blaze on earth. By dawn, the rebellion's fire could be seen from the sea. Columns of smoke rose like black pillars over Barbados, and the scent of scorched sugar drifted across the island. The empire had been wounded, and it would not forgive. British troops, alerted by the plantation owners, mobilized with brutal precision. Militia regiments rode out on horseback, sabers gleaming in the morning Sunday. Behind them came infantry columns, red coats flashing between the green cane. Drums pounded as if the island's heart had begun to march to a foreign rhythm again. The rebels, armed only with machetes, sticks, and a few stolen muskets, fought where they could. They used the terrain, narrow paths, gullies, and fields of thick cane to launch ambushes. For 3 days, the battle raged like a fever dream. Smoke and gunfire blurred the horizon. Women hid messages beneath their skirts, carried water to the wounded, and sang hymns that mingled with the crack of rifles. Children scattered ashes to cover tracks. Even as soldiers advanced, they could not stamp out the belief that had already taken root. When Busa was struck down, his chest torn open by a musket ball, his followers refused to run. They fought harder, shouting his name until it disappeared into gunfire. Nanny Grigg was captured not long after. A squad of soldiers found her near a charred field, her dress torn, her hands bound with rope. Yet when they led her through the ruins of the rebellion, she did not look down. The soldiers whispered that she smiled, not out of defiance, but as though she had seen something beyond their reach. The rebellion was over, but something in the air had changed. The planters rebuilt their estates, the empire declared victory, but the island was never silent again. From Street Phillip to Christ Church, people whispered her name. Nanny Grigg, they said, the woman who lit the fire. In a dim stone cell, Nanny Grigg waited for judgment. The sea wind seeped through the cracks in the wall, carrying the scent of salt and burnt cane. Her wrists were bruised, her clothes stiff with ash. Yet her eyes, those same eyes that had read freedom from a forbidden book, still held their light. When the magistrates arrived, they expected a broken woman. Instead, they found one who stood straight. "Why?" one of them asked. "Did you raise your hand against the crown?" Nanny's voice was low, but it cut through the silence. "If you had been beaten for wanting to breathe," she said, "you too would rise." The room froze. Even the clerk holding the quill hesitated, as if his hand had forgotten the motion of obedience. They called her dangerous, unrepentant, corrupted by faith, but she only smiled faintly. "Faith," she said, "was the first chain they gave us. I only used it to break the rest." Each word she spoke was a blade wrapped in calm. The judges looked away, unable to meet her gaze. They had built laws to control bodies, but they had no defense against conviction. Before the verdict, she was offered mercy if she confessed and named others. She refused. "I did not light a fire to snuff it out myself." When they led her back to the cell, she whispered through the bars to the women in the next room, "Don't fear the rope. Fear forgetting why we began." Outside, the bells tolled for order. Inside, her words became echoes, soft, then steady, then unending. For every empire that believes it can crush rebellion by killing its messengers, there comes a voice like hers, one that turns punishment into scripture. And so, Nanny Grigg waited for her sentence, unafraid, her silence louder than the guns that had silenced her people. The sentence was death. It was delivered without ceremony, in a courtroom heavy with humidity and hypocrisy. The men in powdered wigs spoke of order, discipline, and deterrence, while outside the courthouse, the cane fields still smoldered with the ghosts of rebellion. When the guards came for her, Nanny Grigg did not resist. Her hands were bound, but her steps were measured. The crowd followed in uneasy silence, planters, soldiers, and the enslaved who dared to watch from a distance. The gallows stood tall against the morning sky, its beam glistening with dew. One official asked if she had any last words. She looked out over the faces before her, some pale with guilt, some dark with grief, and spoke softly. "If freedom is a crime, then I am guilty for all of us." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Even the hangman hesitated. But the law of the empire was not made for mercy. The rope was placed around her neck. For a moment, the island seemed to stop breathing. Birds went silent. The surf paused between waves. Then, as the trapdoor fell, there was no scream, only the sound of the rope tightening and the faint rustle of the wind carrying her final words. "Don't kneel anymore." No one dared to cry. Grief was dangerous. Tears were a form of rebellion. So the crowd stood still, faces turned upward, watching as her body swayed gently in the wind like a banner of defiance the empire could not tear down. By afternoon, her body was gone, taken away in secret. They said she was buried in an unmarked grave, as if anonymity could erase her from memory. But those who had heard her voice knew better. The silence that followed her death was not defeat, it was the breath before another storm. The British had killed the woman, but not her words. When the flames died, the earth was gray with ash. The rebellion of 1816 had been crushed. Hundreds were killed, thousands imprisoned, and the island returned on the surface to order. But within that ash, something was growing. Stories of Nanny Grigg spread across the Caribbean. Sailors carried them to Jamaica, to Trinidad, to the Guianas. They spoke of a woman who had read the words of freedom aloud, and for a moment, made them real. In every retelling, she grew larger, not in myth, but in meaning. In the years that followed, whispers of revolt echoed from one island to another. The empire could not stamp them out because it could not unhear them. Songs were written in her memory, sung quietly in the fields, disguised as hymns. In those songs, Nanny became a spirit of flame, the woman who lit the sky. And though her rebellion had failed in arms, it triumphed in influence. 22 years later, in 1838, the British Empire was forced to abolish slavery across its colonies. The chains were broken not by generals, but by the ghosts of those who refused to kneel. In Barbados, freed men and women built small churches on the ruins of plantations. Inside them, beneath crosses made of cane stalks, they whispered her name, Nanny Grigg. Children grew up hearing her story in secret about the night the sugar fields burned like heaven, and about the woman who believed freedom was already theirs. The island healed slowly, but never forgot. Every gust of wind that rustled the cane sounded, to some, like her voice returning. They can bury me, she seemed to say, but they cannot bury the fire. And indeed, they never did. The empire's victory was temporary, her defiance was eternal. For decades after the rebellion, the name Nanny Grigg disappeared from official history. Colonial records referred to her only as a woman agitator or a house servant involved in the disturbance. Her existence was reduced to footnotes, her courage swallowed by the polite language of empire. Barbados returned to its image of order, the jewel once more polished with silence. But silence, too, has memory. In the slave registers, in the faded ink of plantation ledgers, scholars centuries later would find her name scratched faintly beside others who perished. It was enough to begin the resurrection. By the late 20th century, historians started to unearth fragments of the 1816 uprising. In those fragments, a single voice began to echo a woman's voice, literate, faithful, and fierce. Oral histories, passed down in families of freed people, spoke of Miss Nanny, who read the Bible and told the truth that cost her life. For every record that omitted her, there was a grandmother's story that restored her. Slowly, the picture sharpened. Nanny Grigg was not just a servant, but the spark, the mind that turned whispers into movement. Even among the leaders of the rebellion, her influence loomed large. It was her words that gave the uprising its spiritual center, that freedom was not something to be granted, but reclaimed. Barbadian writers began to mention her in poems and essays. School teachers spoke her name in classrooms, once reserved for colonial lessons. Statues of men who had owned slaves still stood, but in the hearts of the people, a new monument was forming invisible, made of belief rather than stone. And perhaps that was the truest kind of monument, one that could not be toppled, because it lived inside every person who refused to bow. Her story, once erased by empire, became the island's quiet heartbeat, a reminder that even if you bury a name, you cannot bury an idea. When the sugar fields swayed under the Caribbean sun, some said they heard the sound of paper rustling like the lost decree of freedom finally being found. Nanny Grigg had no army, no banners, no crown. What she possessed was something infinitely rarer: conviction. She stood in the most brutal system of her time and dared to speak the sentence that would outlive her. They've signed our freedom, they just hid the papers. That sentence was not fact. It was prophecy. Her rebellion failed on the ground, but it succeeded in spirit. It revealed a truth the empire could never unsee, that once the enslaved began to believe in their own humanity, no law, no whip, no gallows could return them to silence. Freedom, she proved, is not a gift. It is an awakening. A century and a half later, when Barbados declared its independence in 1966, people gathered in Street Phillip, the same parish where the rebellion began. They placed flowers in the earth, lit candles beneath the stars, and spoke softly to the wind. You don't need fire anymore, Nanny. Freedom burns bright. Today, her story is more than history. It is a mirror. It reminds us that revolutions begin not with armies, but with ideas whispered in the dark. That the most dangerous weapon against oppression is not the blade, but the voice. When we speak the truth, even quietly, we inherit her courage. So the next time someone asks how freedom began in the Caribbean, tell them it started not in London's parliament, nor in the royal decrees of the crown, but in a woman's whisper, in the rustle of cane at night, in a voice that refused to die. The fire of 1816 burned the fields of Barbados, but its real blaze, the one lit in the heart of a woman named Nanny Grigg, still burns, unextinguished, across every land where people dare to dream of freedom.